Certainly good to see all of you. We are in Luke chapter 9, and we'll get into about verse 43 here in just a moment. But Gary brought something up right at the end of our study on Sunday morning, and I didn't get a chance to explore it much with you. Probably should have, because it's important maybe for us to tie at least Mark's account to this scene that we just saw just before Jesus has this conversation in verse 43 about his coming crucifixion. There was that miracle scene that happens there with the man that Jesus encounters and concerning his son, right? And the interesting part about it is that it's recorded for us that he says, your disciples, I asked them to do this, and they what? They couldn't do it. They weren't able to fulfill it. They weren't able to take care of this situation. And Luke just kind of leaves it at that, right? He didn't give much detail as it relates to the circumstance surrounding that statement that was made. But I want to run you over into Mark's account, because I think it's important, maybe at least for us to take a minute and look at a little more detail of this same scene, because it's an interesting statement that Jesus is going to make to his disciples about why it is they weren't able to handle this particular situation. So just read Mark's account with me here, beginning in Mark chapter 9 and verse 20. They brought him unto him, and when they saw him, straightway the Spirit tear him grievously, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. And he asked his father, Jesus asked the dad of the boy, how long is it since this has been come unto him? And he said, from a child. So we talked briefly about that Sunday morning, didn't get to kind of finalize that conversation, but Luke uses the word boy at one point. It's obvious from Mark's record that this has been going on for a long time, since this young boy was a child, the text says. And the father says, often it's cast him both into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said unto him, and I want you to notice the first statement is, if thou canst, exclamation point. I think Jesus says that with a little bit of fervor, right? In other words, what do you mean, if thou canst? I absolutely can. What's the challenge? Do you have enough belief? Do you believe that I can? And Jesus has no doubts about his abilities and his power to be able to address this situation, but his concern is with this father who's come to him. And he says, all things are possible to him that believeth. And the father begins to cry, and he says what? Yeah, I believe, but help thou my unbelief. Right. So I believe, but help thou mine unbelief. We might even say, I believe, but I just don't know, right? I don't have the confidence I need. And if that's what it takes, if I need greater confidence in you, then help me have that, so that ultimately we can address this problem with my son. And Jesus then saw the multitude coming running together. He rebukes the unclean spirit, and saying unto him, thou dumb and deaf spirit, I command thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. That accomplishes that. The boy becomes as one, appears almost dead at that point. They're concerned that that's the reality. Jesus takes him by the hand in verse 27, raises him up, and he arises. And when he was come into the house, his disciples then asked him privately, how is it that we could not cast it out? This is where I wanted to get to tonight, because we didn't get to talk about this. So we remember the scene. We get a bigger picture now. We get bigger details out of Mark's record of this same miracle. And it's interesting interchange, right, between Jesus and the Father, and Jesus trying to get the Father to understand that his faith in Jesus would help. If you can believe, then you can trust that I can accomplish this. It's not a matter if I can, it's a matter of whether do you believe I can. And do you have the confidence in me to be able to fulfill this? And then he takes this unclean spirit, it's removed, the boy becomes as dead for a moment. Jesus helps him up. But the conversation still has one more piece. The disciples then come to Jesus and ask him what? Why couldn't we do it? You know, obviously they had been approached as it relates to this situation. And Jesus makes an interesting statement in verse 29. He says unto them, this kind can come out by nothing save by prayer, and some translations or some references use prayer and fasting. So it's an interesting piece of the puzzle to think about. This one can't come out except without prayer and fasting, or by prayer and fasting, depending on how you want to look at that. But prayer and fasting on behalf of whom? Who needs to be praying and fasting? All right, you're going to leave that to me, aren't you? Apparently. Okay. So I'm all right. We're willing to take a stab at it here, right? I think his point is the problem wasn't that there was something the boy had done, or even in some sense something the father had done. The problem is the disciples needed something more. I don't know why. Jesus doesn't necessarily give us any more than that, okay? And we could sit around and speculate as to what we might think that means or why it happened that way. And we might get close. I don't know that we'll be able to get 100% definitive as to why Jesus would say that. Probably the best thing I read as it relates to that was the idea that Jesus is trying to encourage his disciples to realize that everything's not going to come easy. Remember, they've already been where? Yeah, they've already been out, right? They'd already been sent out on that limited commission 2 by 2. They've already gone out and they've already been performing miracles, and they got to one that they couldn't perform. This situation with this man's son. And so up until then, they had had what? Success. I think the argument here is probably fair that up until this point, they hadn't had any problems. They'd been able to do exactly what they had set out to do as it relates to performing these miracles, but this one we couldn't handle. Jesus, I believe, is trying to encourage them to realize you needed more than just a simple act. You need to be prayerful and fasting and being engaged in being a follower and disciple, right? You see that imagery where not everything is going to be as easy as you might like it to be in order to be able to fulfill it. And so Jesus adds for them this idea that some things, like this unclean spirit, are going to take more than just a statement from the apostles. Now, we know that all it took was a statement from Jesus, because all the text tells us is Jesus did what? He rebukes it. He rebukes the unclean spirit, and it happens. But that won't be so even for his disciples. And what I appreciate about that is that Jesus' disciples were given power and ability. We've already talked in our class about in Acts chapters 1 and 2, when you see that scene unfold at Pentecost, they're going to be given that additional ability of speaking in tongues, and those kinds of things are going to come. But they are not going to wield the totality of the power of Jesus. They are not going to be given every ounce of who Jesus is and his authority and his power. And they won't be able to exercise that power they're given in the same fashion that Jesus is able to exercise it. So Jesus is able to say to somebody, come out, and it will come out. And Jesus is able to say, thy sins are forgiven thee, and it can be forgiven, because those powers rest within Jesus. As ambassadors and servants and disciples of Jesus, his apostles wouldn't be given the same level of authority and power that Jesus has, and therefore sometimes, he says to them, you're going to have to put more effort than just trying to say or speak something into reality. There may be occasions where you're going to have to be prayerful and fast in order to accomplish the task that's before you. Not everything is going to be casting out an unclean spirit. Not everything's going to be heal the lame and let them walk or let the blind see. There are going to be a whole host of other work and purposes that Jesus is going to give His apostles. And some of that work is going to take more than just a mere statement or a mere thought or an instantaneous reaction. And Jesus, I think, in many senses is helping His apostles maybe begin to appreciate that principle early on, because there are going to be all kinds of things that they have to encounter. That was as clear as I could see it, but He doesn't necessarily say a whole lot more, or it doesn't give us any kind of direct detail as to why He said that.
Would not that prayer and the fasting strengthen them and make them faithful a little stronger, maybe?
I think absolutely, Danny. I think that you would definitely see the ability of how that would encourage and strengthen them in the work and purposes they would be engaged in. And it would help them appreciate that they have a part in this. It's not just they're been given this power and ability, and now it's just theirs to kind of wield however they choose. There's purpose behind it, and they're going to have to stay diligent and be strengthened along the way as it relates to that.
Another same thing. Maybe I'm the only one who's out in the field, but this, when you pray for something, and you have all faith that it's going to happen, and then, but you're never sure if it's going to be God's will or not, and then when it doesn't happen, it kind of comes around and takes you by such surprise or something. So I feel like sometimes, at least myself, I have to kind of rate that in a little bit. Does anybody else do the same thing?
No, I get you. And I think you're right. I think it can be, right? Because and I don't necessarily know whether that's the conversation here, but it is a conversation in other narratives of the Bible when He talks about the importance of faith and prayer and their combination between the two. And I think you're right. It is hard when we want to pray in faith, but the answers don't always match what my will is. God's will may not match mine. And how I handle those moments are challenging. And how I react when the responses I receive aren't what I expected or hoped for or even prayed for, and not to let that affect my faith. And I think that it's a legitimate challenge that every disciple has to address and deal with. I think that isn't left field. I think that's fair. I think for all of us to have to kind of come to terms with how am I going to react and respond when my prayers aren't answered in exactly the way that I had hoped or fashioned. And I think that I've always encouraged folks to have to, somehow we've got to be able to keep our eye in eternal things in order to do that. Because I think what happens is when those moments occur, we kind of get pulled into the here and now. And we're only thinking about the moment I'm in, and I didn't get what I was looking for in this moment I'm in. And we lose sight of what really encourages and leads and strengthens faith, and that is the eternal side of things. That's what I would encourage people to do, is to try to stay steadfast in their minds about eternal things when the temporary doesn't seem to be helping my faith in the moment. But I appreciate the thought.
Go ahead.
Do you think He's trying to bring His disciples up to another level of spirituality? Because later on here, He tells them, listen to this, let this sink deep in your ear. And then they start squabbling about who's going to be the greatest at the kingdom. Because I think He's just trying to bring them up another level there, so they can see that some things they will not be able to do. They have to have His help on them.
Yeah.
I do think he's trying to encourage them to appreciate those kinds of things as it relates to their relationship and to Him and the work that they were going to be engaged in. And it's all part of that educational process that they're going through.
Do you think being human beings, what they did kind of went over their head a little bit, maybe? And because they said they come to Jesus with joy, saying, "Oh, they're done."
I, yes, I think that humanity can kick in, and it might have been pretty disheartening when they'd had success, and now all of a sudden they encounter this situation, and now they're questioning. So I think there is a level of humility that's going to come, and I think the situation that's about to unfold that we'll get to here in just a minute will illustrate that a little bit as well.
He means by the words this kind.
Yeah.
I think he is referring when this kind can come out by nothing save by prayer. It seems very, very specific. And again, I don't know, right? Because he doesn't tell us what he means by that. The record doesn't necessarily inform us as to what was different about this. We could surmise, right? We could look and see the kinds of things that's happening to this young child. The fact that there had been this longevity, when he's asked, how long has this been happening? He says, since he's a child, this has been going on. And so you can read all kinds of things, but there's some thought that it's an illustration of the longer and more deeply rooted something is, the harder it is to address it. And some imply that this might be a picture of that here's a situation that has been going on for a long, long time, and the more deeply rooted it is, the more difficult it is, this kind, something that's more deeply rooted. And again, could I prove that? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, no, because I don't have anything to base that on except just context and trying to comprehend the scene here. But I don't have any direct, you know what I mean? So he doesn't define it. He doesn't say what he means by this kind. We know what it was, and so if it's a very specific kind of connection, then we know what it is. But there is something different. You struggle, right? Because what was different about this one than the guy over there with the Gadarenes? What was that guy seemed pretty challenged too. They tried to tie him up and do all kinds of things, and he's running around without any clothes. That seems pretty extraordinary as well, and this doesn't come up there. But the difference there might be this comes on the heels of after his disciples had been empowered. And I think that maybe is what we have to kind of keep in mind, is that this conversation isn't a comparison of what Jesus had done in some senses and what Jesus is doing now, because he was still able to just rebuke the devil, the unclean spirit, and it was gone. This is more about the power that his disciples had been granted and how they were going to have to use that power. And sometimes this kind of deeply rooted challenge is going to take more than just a statement from his disciples. They're going to have a greater commitment, in a sense, prayer in particular, as it relates to that. But it's a good question. He just doesn't.
Sorry, hand the back first, not the back. Good.
I was just
The other one, sorry.
where it says how could we not cast it out? I think it's a humbling moment of them to remember where they got the power to begin with, whose power it really is. It's not theirs.
Yeah.
It's God's.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a humbling moment for them, because like I said, they have been out already doing great things.
Yeah.
And I think too, let me just add, remember, you go back to, if I can, it's harder in Mark's account, but in verse 19, what's his, oh faithless generation, right? Jesus, he's not just saying that to he's saying that to everybody, right? As it relates to that. And so these disciples are going to have to accept some personal accountability and responsibility. And, you can almost hear Jesus saying, well, if he formed it in the form of a question, did you pray concerning that when you weren't having any success at it? Did you maybe do some fasting and try to devote yourself to that. If you think about it from a question standpoint, you can almost see where he's trying to get them to see, well, yeah, you were humbled. And rather than just saying, well, I guess we can't do it, maybe some praying and fasting would have helped build enough within you to be able to address whatever this was, right? So it is interesting.
When he tells the spirit to come out, and he says, and enter him no more. Is that the only time he ever tells them to enter him no more?
I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But that's a good question. If this is the question was, is this the only time you see that kind of thought where Jesus rebukes the unclean spirit, get out, and don't come back? But it is interesting to think about the fact that, and what that tells me is, I guess what it does tell us is that's a possibility. If Jesus says it, right? I think otherwise you say it if it's an impossibility. But it's interesting anyway. But I don't have any definitive answer.
In chapter 17, beginning in verse 14. Said when they asked Jesus why could we not cast him out, in verse 20, Jesus said unto them, because of your unbelief, for verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Howbeit this kind goeth out, not out, but by prayer and fasting.
And I think you're right.
Matthew and Mark are very similar in the things that they say, but you do see just slightly more each of the accounts. Luke is the vaguest, right? He just kind of tells us what happens and then he's moving on. But Mark and Matthew both spend a little more time. And it's interesting, just keep in mind too, that when that conversation about praying and fasting and the faith of a mustard seed, if you could have just had just a little more confidence that what I'm able to accomplish in you is available. I didn't send you out for purposes that you couldn't accomplish. And if you had had the faith of a mustard seed, you could have told a mountain to go away, and it would have went away. It's interesting when you add that point as well, right? You begin to build a whole big picture of what Jesus is trying to encourage his disciples to do. It seems to me that at the end result is simply this, that Jesus says, your faith isn't where it needs to be yet. This situation humbled you. With some prayer and fasting, you can build your faith and improve your ability to address the various situations and circumstances that maybe initially you failed at, that you came in contact. It's amazing, and I don't know why all three of those accounts are they're not different in terms they contradict each other, but they just all give details that the others don't necessarily give. Yep.
He's saying ye of little faith. So there's not a complete absence of faith in this verse or in these chapters. For the man's son, he believes that Christ can heal his son. But he don't have the strong faith as what he needs to have.
Yeah. And of course, this conversation here in verse 20 of Matthew 17 about little faith is actually directed to the apostles, but the Father. If you read the other accounts, right, you see that reference. And you're right. I think when that's why he makes the statement. I believe. I have some faith. So he's not void of faith, but help my unbelief. I'm not as fully persuaded and convicted as I need to be. And by the way, we can all find ourselves there sometimes, right? You know, where we've got a level of faith and a level of understanding and a level of belief. And sometimes our prayer before the Father isn't help me believe. It's just strengthen the belief that I already have. Let that mustard seed grow. It's fascinating to me. Mustard seeds are teeny tiny. They're minuscule, they're tiny. And so whatever amount of faith they had, Jesus qualified it as less than that, right? Because he said if you'd had the faith of a mustard seed, you could have removed mountains. And so their faith was still pretty weak in their conviction, but not non-existent, but just it needed to grow and improve. Luke chapter 9. Happens every time, right? Can I cover 50 verses in 15 minutes? So we talked a little bit about this already, but I felt it important to come back and look at those narratives, and we just ran out of time doing that Sunday. And it's funny because all the descriptors on the YouTube says we're in Luke 9:43. That was a lie. Sorry, anybody at home. I didn't mean to lie to you, but apparently I did because we're just now to Luke 9:43. But anyway, they were all astonished, notice, in verse 43 of Luke 9, at the majesty of God. But while all were marveling at all the things which he did, he said unto his disciples, let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man shall be delivered up into the hands of men. Great excitement, we are doing great things. Jesus is demonstrating power nobody's seen before. And they're as excited as I imagine anybody would have been following Jesus in those days. It's all pretty good. Miracles are happening. Power is being demonstrated. But now they're having to start to come to terms with the fact that Jesus basically says, my time is what? Yeah, it's limited, right? I'm going to eventually die. I'm going to be delivered into the hands of men. They're not grasping it yet, the text says. But they understood not this saying, and it was concealed from them, that they should not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this saying. It's interesting, right? So they didn't quite get, what does he mean? I'm going to be delivered. And think about it, how could a man who can handle every demon that they've ever encountered have any trouble dealing with men? How could that happen, right? How could it be even possible that this one we've been following, who has demonstrated his power and ability over anything and everything, ever fall into the hands of men? So you can understand they're just kind of, I don't know what he's talking about there. He desires for that to stay concealed, not ready to reveal that in great detail yet. And he's not ready to reveal it in its fullness. They don't want to know anything more about it either, the text says. And so it just kind of stops. But an interesting situation comes on in verse 46. So there arose a reasoning among them, which of them was the greatest. By the way, is this the last time they'll have this kind of conversation? No. In fact, in about a year from now, when we're in Luke 22, they're going to be still arguing about the time that he girds himself with a towel and washes his feet of his disciples shortly before his death. They're still arguing over who the greatest is. You see that scene where the mother of James and John comes to all those kinds of things. Those things are still yet to happen. And so this argument about who was the greatest among them is something that they're dealing with in the early stages, and it's something that was still plaguing them right up towards the end. Now I'm make this note here. Well, let's keep going. I'll reference something to you here in a moment. So Jesus saw the reasoning of their heart, and he takes a little child and set him aside, or set him by his side, and said unto them, whosoever shall receive this little child in my name receiveth me, and whosoever shall receive me receiveth him that sent me. For he that is least among you all, the same is great. Again, Luke gives us, right, the narrow version. Luke gives us the shortened version. You go to Matthew 18, 1 through 5, and that's where we learn, except ye be converted as a little child. You also see in Matthew 18's account, he'll say, unless you humble yourself as this child I brought before you. Mark's account in Mark 9, is interesting because Mark's record records for us, Jesus even asks them more specifically, Luke records that he perceives, right, that they're reasoning within themselves about this. Mark adds a little extra. He tells us that Jesus actually looks at his disciples and goes, hey, what are you guys arguing about? What were you guys reasoning about while we were traveling here? Now, can you imagine? Think about it that way. It's one thing for Jesus to kind of perceive it and then address it with this bringing a child in among them and give them this short little brief, visual lesson. Can you imagine? It's a whole other thing for Jesus to look at them and say, hey, why don't you tell me what it is you guys were talking about while we were walking down the road here? And they're going to have to admit that, well, we were arguing over which one of us was going to be the best. It's an interesting piece of that. And Mark's account also gives us, I believe in verse 38 of that record, that's where he teaches that lesson, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So again, you get a bigger picture. Matthew 18, Mark 9, they're relevant to what's happening here in Luke's record. But it's interesting. What I appreciate is just kind of a side note, by the way, as it relates to Jesus here is what I like about what Jesus does in his teaching method here is he's not afraid of illustration. You think about that. Sometimes, and again, I think illustration can get over the top, and we have to be careful when we're using things, visual aids and whatever it might be, to try to help illustrate a point. But Jesus was not adverse to using visual illustration. He doesn't just reference a child. He does what? Yeah, he takes one and he sets the child among them, and he says, and he points to the child and says, unless you become like this child. And Jesus wasn't opposed to illustration, and Jesus used what he had. Right? He didn't have the technology that we have to be able to show illustration or give examples of what it is that a certain passage or text might be addressing. But Jesus used all kinds of illustrations like that. And in this case, he brings a child right into the midst of them and says, unless you're as humble as this child, unless you can be converted in the same manner, with the same humility as this child, you can't inherit the kingdom. And then you read Luke's account, and he has this idea of, if you receive this little child in my name, receiveth me, and whosoever shall receive me receiveth him that sent me. For he that is least among you all, the same is great. With humility, you can be the kind of followers that
God is looking.
So they still thinking human kingdom?
It doesn't.
Does it sound like it?
Right.
Yes, Jim, I think you're right, because who's the greatest, right? Who's going to get, if they're even beginning to perceive that Jesus may not be there forever, one of us is going to take precedent. You can think that human reasoning coming out there as well. Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
I have something about. Sure. If you don't want to chase this rabbit, that's fine.
All right, I get you.
But going down a couple verses in Mark there, when the apostles were telling Jesus that they stopped this man from casting out demons, and he was not one of us. Who might he be? Is someone that Christ had given power to, that he could cast out demons in his name? He told them, don't stop him, because if he's doing it in my name, let him dead.
And so let's add that, right? That's the last of Luke's record as well.
In verses 49 and 50, where and you keep it in Luke's context, it's interesting, right? Because on the heels of Jesus saying, you got to be what? You got to be humble, and you got to be like this little child, and you've got to be willing to be great by being less, being the least. And that whole conversation, and my feeling in some ways is that you could almost hear the shake in John's voice. As Jesus just told him, you got to be humble. You want to be a follower of mine, you got to be like this little child. And so so notice, Luke records, and John answers. So John's statement is right on the heels of Jesus giving them this visual illustration with this child. And John says, well, Master, we saw one casting out demons in thy name, and we forbade him, because he followeth not with us. But Jesus said unto him, forbid him not, for he that is not against you is for you. Now, Mark's record and others illustrate the same basic point, that there's this situation. But I think in some ways, we could fast forward a little bit in order to help answer that. But so back to the question, though, who is this? Is that what the question is? Who's he talking about? And in specific, I don't know that we could say, right? I don't know that we could say. But what it seems to be implying is that up until now, John and the other apostles, I'll put them with him, I believe, have been under the impression that they have been given exclusivity, right? And when John says with us, I think that's who he means. They're not one of the 12, okay? But it's interesting. Who read ahead a little bit? If you read ahead a little bit, Jesus is about to send out another group of people, isn't he? How many is he going to send, Larry? He's going to send 70. Where'd they come from? Right? So my point is, John is now going to have to start coming to terms with, even though they may have some exclusivity, right? We learned that earlier about how Jesus told them, not everybody has the same ability to discern the things that you all are going to be able to discern. But we're going to learn here very quickly in the history that there's a whole bunch of folks who Jesus is going to entrust to go out and begin to fulfill his work. And we'll get there. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but they're actually given power to perform miracles as well. And so I think John's point, or Jesus' point with John is, listen, if they're for us, they're for us. And Jesus is going to be the one that's going to be able to discern that. And John doesn't get to pick and choose as it relates to those things. And if you again add Mark's record, Mark says, Jesus said, who could perform a miracle and then treat me bad? So I think whoever these people are, they've proven themselves to Jesus to be able to serve and honor him. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what
If my memory serves me correctly, Jesus has a large group of disciples other than just the 12. And it was out of that larger group of disciples that he chose the 12. And that goes along with what you're saying about John, that he thinking just the 12 and that this other person's not one of those 12. You got to remember, Jesus did have that larger group of disciples, of which then later, as you're pointing to, the 70 would come. Yeah.
And back to your question real quick, Bob, and I'll come right back to this Sunday morning and talk a little bit, but whomever they are accurately staying connected to Jesus. So they aren't just guys that have gone off on their own and are proclaiming the name of Jesus and taking ownership of that. Jesus said, if they're out here performing miracles, then they're not going to be doing evil against me. They're with me. And we're just not going to necessarily be privy to exactly who they are. We just know they exist. And Jesus is going to put a lot of them to work here shortly and send them out to fulfill his purposes. But it's not. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah. And that's so either they didn't know of or they weren't humble enough to recognize that Jesus could use others besides them. Maybe that's what's really here, is that's the lesson, right? That's the lesson they're learning. You got to be humble like this child. You've got to be willing to be converted like this child, and that seems to be maybe the impression he's trying to make. You've got to have some humility here, because I'm not going to just use you. I'm going to use a bunch of other folks for my cause. And he'll have another encounter with them before he's done here, with a situation in Samaria that he has to deal with, where he has to calm them down when they want to, drive them all dead. I'll come back Sunday. Classes are already up, so I'll come back Sunday, Lord willing.